Uh, Welcome to the deep dive. Really glad to have you with us today. Our mission for this session is to analyze a pretty comprehensive new report from HelpNet Security.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It really is. It's drawing on 2025 data compiled by Coalition. And we are looking at a massive sample size here. We're talking about encompassing over 100,000 policyholders across the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Germany.
Right, which makes it a data set of immense scale.
Hmm.
And because it spans so many distinct regulatory and corporate environments, it provides this highly accurate diagnostic of the current cybercrime economy.
Exactly.
We aren't just looking at isolated incidents here. We're observing global behavioral shifts among threat actors.
And the overarching theme of those shifts is, it's actually quite encouraging for anyone managing a network right now.
Surprisingly so, yeah.
Yeah, the data shows that our defensive postures are largely holding up. Organizations are actually fighting back and mitigating damage, but the consequence of that success is that hackers are being forced to aggressively restructure their business models.
They have to adapt. And to fully grasp that restructuring, we need to look past the technical mechanics of the exploits and focus on the economic drivers. We want to unpack the financial motivations behind these attacks, how the most resilient organizations are absorbing the impact, and how you can apply these strategic lessons to your own environment.
Right.
Essentially, we are examining an adversarial economy that is actively adapting to your defensive wins.
Okay, let's unpack this because I want to start with the absolute heavyweights of the current threat landscape. We're talking business email compromise, or BEC, and funds transfer fraud, FTF.
The big two.
The big two. When you consolidate the claims from 2025, these two tactics combine to make up 58% of all cyber insurance claims. I mean, more than half of the entire battle is being fought right there in the inbox.
Which highlights a really persistent reality about corporate vulnerability. I mean, for all the investment in sophisticated perimeter defenses and, endpoint detection, the path of least resistance for extracting capital still routes directly through daily emailed communication.
Yeah, the human element. Let's look at the BEC metric specifically because it remains the single most common claim type. It's sitting right at 31%. And year over year, the frequency of these attacks actually rose by 15%.
Right. They are trying harder than ever.
But the data reveals a compelling countertrend regarding the actual financial impact. Even with that surge in attack volume, the average losses per BEC incident dropped by 28%. It landed at $27,000.
That reduction in average severity is perhaps the most critical early indicator of successful defense in this entire report.
How so?
Well, it suggests a significant maturation in how quickly organizations are identifying anomalous inbox behavior. The attackers are still getting in, which explains that 15% frequency spike, but the dwell time has been drastically reduced.
So they aren't hanging around as long.
Exactly. If you could spot the unauthorized access and sever the session before the threat actor has time to map out the communication flows and locate the financial levers, you mitigate the catastrophic losses.
That makes total sense. Looking at the numbers, it paints a pretty clear operational line, which brings us to the second half of this, funds transfer fraud. FTF accounted for 27% of claims. And mirroring the BEC trend, its average severity dropped 14% to $141,000.
Which is still a lot, but a notable drop.
Yeah. And it seems apparent that BEC isn't just an endpoint for these actors. It's basically the reconnaissance phase for FTF.
What's fascinating here is the seamless integration of those two phases. The coalition data shows that BEC was a direct precursor to FTF in 52% of the events.
Wow, over half.
Over half. Threat actors compromise the account and then essentially go dormant. They monitor the traffic, they study the invoicing cadence, and they learn the specific phrasing used by your finance department or your key vendors.
So they are just waiting for a high-value transaction to enter the pipeline so they can seamlessly inject themselves into the thread and alter the routing numbers. And the success of that phase relies heavily on manipulating the human element within your organization. The report noted that 71% of these FTF events involve social engineering. Impersonating executives or mimicking those trusted vendors.
And that social engineering aspect relies on manufactured urgency. They push an employee to bypass standard verification protocols. But we should also analyze where the most concentrated financial damage originates within FTF.
Right.
While social engineering drives the volume of the claims, fraudulent instructions sent directly to financial institutions represent a distinct and highly damaging category. That specific tactic only accounted for 20% of FTF events, but the average loss spiked to $218,000.
So when they bypass the targeted employee entirely and just trick the bank into authorizing the transfer, the resulting payout is substantially higher.
The payout is higher, and it requires a deeper level of compromise. It often involves the extraction of administrative banking credentials or the manipulation of back-end authorization tokens.
It's terrifying, but there is a notable victory detailed in the report regarding these stolen funds. In 2025, Coalition actually recovered $21.8 million in intercepted capital.
That is a huge win.
It really is. That averages out to a recovery of $202,000 per incident, with successful recoveries occurring in 32% of reported FTF events.
And that metric challenges the outdated assumption that once a fraudulent wire clears, the capital is just permanently lost. It demonstrates that swift incident response, combined with established channels to law enforcement and financial institutions, can freeze those assets before they are laundered through multiple overseas accounts or converted to cryptocurrency.
It is a strong argument for having your incident response runbooks heavily emphasize the first 24 hours post-discovery.
Absolutely. Speed is everything.
But moving from the inbox to the broader network, we really need to address ransomware.
Yeah, we do.
Ransomware accounted for 21% of claims. And while the overall frequency of attacks remained flat year over year, the initial ransom demands have surged dramatically. The average opening demand jumped 47% to over $1.019 million.
The opening bids have crossed the seven-figure threshold on average. That reflects a highly calculated psychological strategy by the threat actors.
And the spectrum of those demands is incredibly wide. The report noted peak demands reaching $16 million for heavily targeted enterprise environments, while opportunistic attacks on smaller organizations saw demands closer to $9,000.
That variance confirms that ransomware operators are performing rigorous financial underwriting on their victims before they even deploy the encryption payload.
They're doing their homework.
Oh, absolutely. They are analyzing your cyber insurance policies, reviewing your public financial filings, and calculating the exact threshold of pain your specific balance sheet can absorb.
The major players driving these figures are well-known variants, too. Akira was the most prevalent, appearing in 25% of incidents with an average demand of $926,000.
A volume-based player.
Right. Queensland followed at 12%, pushing an average demand of $1.16 million. But Ransom Hub, despite only accounting for 7% of cases, carried the highest average demand at $2.33 million.
The disparity between Akira's volume-based approach and RansomHub's concentrated high-demand strategy points to different operational tiers within the ransomware as a service ecosystem.
Yeah.
A group like RansomHub is likely investing a lot more time in lateral movement, ensuring they compromise the most critical Tier 1 assets and sensitive data stores to justify that $2.33 million opening bid.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The victims are largely refusing to play the game. An impressive 86% of ransomware victims simply decline to pay the demand.
That 86% refusal rate is the primary catalyst forcing the shift in the cyber underworld that we discussed earlier. It's massive. But we should also examine the 14% of organizations that did feel their operational continuity required payment.
Right. For that subset, the data highlights the sheer effectiveness of utilizing professional ransom negotiators. When victims deployed specialized negotiators, they managed to slash those initial $1 million demands by an average of 65%.
That is a huge reduction.
Yeah, that brought the average final payment down to $355,000, with the median payment resting at $200,000.
Because negotiators changed the dynamic from a panic-driven hostage situation to a pragmatic business transaction. They stall for time while the incident response team assesses the backup viability. They demand concrete proof of life for any exfiltrated data, and they leverage intelligence on the specific threat actor's historical willingness to actually provide a working decryptor.
So it takes the wind out of their sails.
Exactly. It drastically undercuts the leverage of the initial multi-million-dollar shock and awe tactic.
And that diminished leverage is reflected in the final severity metrics. Despite the massive surge in initial demands, the actual average financial loss from a ransomware claim dropped 19% to $262,000. The demands are skyrocketing, but the ultimate financial realization for the attackers is shrinking.
What stands out to you? I mean, why are losses dropping while the demands are climbing so fast?
Well, to understand why that gap exists, we have to look at the architectural improvements organizations have made. Shelley Ma, the incident response lead at Coalition, provided crucial context here. The severity is dropping primarily because backup-based recovery protocols are successfully working in production environments.
But it is not enough to just possess backups. The architecture of those backups is what is actually saving organizations from paying these demands.
Right. Shelley Ma outlined a rigorous set of technical requirements for this. To survive a modern deployment, backups must be hardened and entirely immutable.
Which is key.
Yeah. They must be logically or physically isolated from the primary production network, secured with distinct credentials and mandatory MFA, and validated through frequent full-scale restore exercises.
That emphasis on full restore exercises is vital. I mean, if your recovery time objective is measured in weeks because you haven't tested the throughput of your backup architecture, the resulting business interruption costs might end up exceeding the ransom demand anyway.
Yeah, you're paying either way at that point.
Exactly. The organizations refusing to pay are the ones who can restore their identities and critical applications swiftly and confidently.
So we have effectively countered the traditional encryption playbook.
We have. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the threat actors aren't retreating. They are pivoting to bypass those immutable backups entirely, leading to the rise of what we call dual extortion.
Right.
Dual extortion is the direct market response to resilient backup architecture. If the attacker knows your backups will render their encryption payload useless, they shift their leverage to confidentiality.
They steal the data instead.
Yep. They exfiltrate your proprietary data, your customer records, or your strategic communications before they trigger the ransomware, threatening public release if the demand is ignored.
And the 2025 data confirms this pivot is practically universal now. Dual extortion accounts for 70% of all ransomware claims, carrying an average loss of $299,000. Compare that to attacks relying solely on encryption or solely on data exfiltration, which only accounted for 15% each. The entire ecosystem has transitioned to data weaponization.
It really has.
So what does this all mean? If a perfectly executed, immutable backup strategy no longer neutralizes the threat of an extortion demand, how should you be adapting your defensive posture now?
It necessitates a fundamental shift from pure infrastructure defense to rigorous data governance. Shelley Ma emphasized that defense strategies must now be highly sector-specific, focusing on the distinct vulnerabilities of your particular operating environment.
Looking at her recommendations for the industrial and manufacturing sectors, the primary directive remains continuity. Because downtime in an operational technology environment compounds financial losses at an exponential rate, the strategy leans heavily into rapid failover.
Right.
It requires rehearsed manual workarounds so that physical production lines can maintain a baseline of operation even while the digital control network is isolated and being rebuilt.
Conversely, if you are managing a network in healthcare, financial services, or really any sector, handling dense concentrations of personally identifiable information, your strategy has to center on data minimization and aggressive segmentation.
You essentially have to shrink the attack surface of your own data stores.
Exactly. The most effective defense against data extortion is ensuring the data doesn't exist in a vulnerable state to begin with. If you implement strict retention policies that purge legacy data, and you segment your crown jewel data from general user networks, you limit what an attacker can successfully exfiltrate. You are actively reducing their leverage.
Which naturally leads us to evaluate how these threat actors are gaining access to those data stores in the first place.
The front door.
The front door. When you look at your own attack surface, the primary entry points highlighted in the Coalition report might prompt a review of your external edge. VPNs were the undisputed primary target. They were identified as the entry point in 59% of ransomware incidents where the compromised technology could be confirmed.
And the irony there is notable. The infrastructure deployed specifically to secure remote access is currently the most exploited vulnerability in the corporate perimeter.
It's crazy.
The report explicitly called out targeted vulnerabilities in major vendors, including SonicWall, Fortinet, Cisco, Citrix, and Palo Alto networks.
And following VPNs, remote desktop applications accounted for another 14% of initial access vectors. The report quantified the specific risk multipliers for these technologies, and the metrics are stark. Exposing VPN login panels to the public internet makes an organization 3 to 4 times more likely to experience a cyberclaim.
3 to 4 times. And if your remote desktop applications are exposed to the public internet, your likelihood of a claim jumps by 3 to 8 times.
Wow.
It is a statistical confirmation that internet-facing management interfaces are the highest risk components of your architecture.
The specific methods used to breach those interfaces are equally telling. Software exploits were the leading attack vector, driving 38% of ransomware incidents. This underscores the reality of modern initial access brokers. They aren't manually probing your specific firewall. They are utilizing automated scanning infrastructure that relentlessly maps the internet, searching for devices running firmware with known, unpatched CVEs.
It is a race between the vendor releasing the patch and the automated scanner finding your unpatched edge device.
It's just a matter of time.
Yeah. And following those software exploits, compromised credentials accounted for 27% of the attack vectors, which circles right back to the human element and the critical necessity of enforcing robust authentication policies across all external access points.
Absolutely. So as we synthesize all of this intelligence from the 2025 coalition data, the big picture summary offers a very clear mandate. The global frequency of claims did tick upward by 3%, indicating that the threat landscape remains highly active. However, the global average severity fell by a substantial 19%, down to $116,000.
Furthermore, the fact that 64% of closed claims were resolved with zero out-of-pocket costs to the policyholder is a massive testament to the effectiveness of modern cyber insurance and incident response integration.
Yeah, that's huge.
The core takeaway is that disciplined defense strategies, like those immutable backups and rapid detection protocols, are decisively winning the technical battle against traditional network encryption.
But that victory has fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. By hardening the infrastructure, we have forced the adversaries to rely on data exfiltration, psychological pressure through dual extortion, and the social engineering tactics seen in funds transfer fraud. The technical perimeter is stronger, so the attackers are targeting the data itself and the humans who manage it.
This raises an important question, especially as the battleground shifts so heavily toward data privacy and liability. Hidden within the privacy liability section of this report was a deeply striking anomaly.
Oh yeah, the privacy law thing.
Yeah. 72% of all privacy rights allegations in 2025 cited the California Invasion of Privacy Act. But that statute wasn't written for the digital age at all. It was enacted in 1967 to regulate wiretapping on physical telephone lines.
Which is wild. Today, plaintiff attorneys are successfully utilizing that 1967 law as a primary legal weapon against modern web tracking technologies. They're applying it to session replay tools and automated AI-driven chat features embedded in corporate websites.
It creates a fascinating and highly volatile regulatory environment. As threat actors pivot entirely to data extortion, the legal frameworks governing that data are experiencing bizarre collisions across different eras. It really makes you wonder, as your organization implements the next generation of AI tools and automated data analytics, what other ancient, dormant statutes from half a century ago are sitting on the books right now, perfectly positioned to completely upend your cyber liability in the near future?
That is definitely a complex landscape to navigate, blending cutting-edge threat intelligence with decades-old legal exposure. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. The adversarial economy is constantly shifting, but by examining the data and adapting your governance strategies, you can maintain your operational resilience. Keep analyzing the risks within your own environment, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.